So we're going to cultivate the 4 divine mental states. We're going to go a little deeper into this practice than usual, working in some very traditional ways, but at the same time we're going to bring some new tools to the framework of the Brahma-Viharas to work with some things that maybe aren't as traditional, but will help our understanding of these things and how they apply to us. So first, I want to go over the preliminaries of what I'm talking about. So the Buddha pointed out that there were 4 mental states that we should all cultivate, regardless of whether we're monks or householders or whatever, in business or family, with regards to our family, all of those things, that we should bring these 4 mental states to our lives. And these are called the Brahma-Viharas, which Brahma was basically in the Indian cosmology. Brahmas were the highest gods, so this was the highest god state. And Viharas means abodes, basically. So this is the most refined place you can live, the Brahma-Viharas, or sometimes called the sublime abidings, or the boundless states. And they start with metta. We usually see metta translated as loving kindness or goodwill. I'm not crazy about either of those translations. There's nothing really wrong with them. They're just not as complete as I'd like for them to be. So I'm going to probably use the term metta mostly as we go through these next few weeks. But basically it's a strong desire for some being, oneself or others, to be happy. And so basically to be actualizing, free from animosity, free from stress, and to live peacefully. We're going to talk, I'm going to do a little digression in a week or two about what happiness means when we're doing this. But for right now, as we go through this process of metta bhavana, bhavana means cultivation, cultivating this state of goodwill and loving kindness. We're going to work on it for ourselves. We're going to wish this for ourselves. We're going to wish ourselves well, and then we're going to expand that to include others. And one of the things that we don't want to do is try to engage in problem solving for other people. So you don't have to worry about what happiness should mean to others as we do this. Just wishing them happy is enough, right? And then, so the idea is, if I have metta for you, then I want you to be happy, I want you to do well. So if I want you to be happy and I want you to do well, I don't want you to suffer. And so that's the second of the Brahma-Viharas. The Pali word is karuna. A pretty good straightforward translation of that is compassion. So I'll usually refer to compassion. And it's basically a desire for someone to not suffer. And we'll give some thought to what suffering means, what we mean when we talk about suffering, as we go through this also. The third one is kind of subtle. The Pali word is mudita, and it's usually translated something like sympathetic joy or appreciation. Think about it this way. I want you to be happy and to do well. I want you to not suffer. If you have good fortune, then how I'm going to feel? I'm going to be glad. Okay? So it's gladness, not only in my own good fortune, but in the good fortunes of others. And it kind of relates to gratitude. It's the antidote to jealousy or envy. What happens usually when somebody that we know has goodwill? We resent it, right? So with someone we know has good fortune, we'd like to feel good about that. So when you practice this, when something good happens to someone, even someone you don't like or don't know very well, then you're happy for that. And we're going to work with gratitude as we do this. We'll work with it in meditation also, but this is a place where we really kind of come to acknowledge the fact that metta, goodwill, flows both ways. That we're not just sending it out, but we're recipients of it without even being aware of that a lot of the time. So about 3 or 4 weeks from now, we'll dig pretty deeply into that idea. And so we get to also appreciate and enjoy the fact that we're recipients of compassion. And we'll do this, like I said, partly through meditation, but also partly through the use of a process called Nikon, which is where we really work with gratitude as a method of self-exploration. And then finally, the last of these is upeka, which translates fairly well into the idea of equanimity. So I want you to do well. I want you to not suffer. I'd like for you to have good fortune and keep it. Sometimes bad things happen. Okay. Sometimes bad things happen to me. Sometimes bad things happen to you. And we can acknowledge and accept the fact that difficulties happen without losing our minds over it. So equanimity doesn't mean that everything is equal, that there's no good and no bad. It's recognizing that good and bad are kind of relative terms, and that we can endure difficulties without losing our balance. So equanimity is basically a state of mental balance. So when we cultivate the Brahma-Viharas, the process begins with cultivating metta. And so you start out by wanting happiness, and then you go from there. And we'll do this in a little while in meditation, and many of you have done this with me quite a bit in guided meditations. I'm not going to guide you tonight, because a lot of you it will have been the 150th time you've listened to me do that, but also because I want you to be able to do this on your own. So I'm going to give you some instruction, and you have a little cheat sheet you can work with. And if you still need help, there's a downloadable guided version of this on our website that you can use. So take a look at this diagram on the handout that I gave you. And you see what looks kind of like a target, some concentric circles. So when we do this meditation, kind of think of yourself as the center of that target. And so we start out by wishing for happiness for ourselves. And then after you've worked with that for a while, you're going to wish for happiness for a loved one, and then a good friend, and then a neutral person, and then someone hostile that you're having some conflict with, and finally all beings. So take a minute now and just kind of look at that and put yourself in the center of that circle. And then start choosing the people that you want in the other circles. Now usually when I guide this, I don't ask you to think in advance about who you want in those circles. But for the purposes of what we're doing for the next few weeks, I think it's kind of helpful to go ahead and have an idea as you go into it, who you're going to think of. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, especially when you get to the part about sending goodwill to somebody you don't like, you're liable to encounter some resistance. And the impulse usually is to change and think of somebody else. And I don't want you to do that. I want you to work with the resistance. So take a moment and think, okay, who is your loved one? Now the loved one should be someone living. Should be someone who's close to you, emotionally close to you, who's been supportive of you in some ways. The traditional thing to use would be your mother, but some people have put their mothers in the difficult person position. So you want this to be someone who, when you think of them, a sense of gratitude and awareness of them as being a good and important person in your life will naturally arise. Because we all want ourselves to be happy, we want ourselves to do well, and we want to take that and we want to expand that to someone else that's close to us. So we want that transition from wanting me happy to wanting you happy to be a fairly smooth one. And for a lot of us, thinking about our loved one, our mother, or our father, or our spouse, our child, that goodwill actually arises even more naturally out of that than it does for ourselves. And then think about a good friend. So you want this to be someone that you feel pretty supported by, somebody you like being around, that you enjoy spending time with, done you some favors or whatever. Now the neutral person becomes kind of challenging. You want someone who you know, but you don't know too well, maybe. You don't really have a feeling about one way or the other. Could be somebody at work that you pass in the hall but you've never had a conversation with. Could be somebody you see at the grocery store all the time, something like that. You will find that your feelings for them changes over the course of the next few weeks as you work with this. And that's okay. That's kind of part of the process too. So they may be neutral now, but 6 weeks from now not be a neutral person. That's all right. Stick with them anyway, because we'll kind of expand beyond that too. And then the next person is someone hostile to you in some way, someone with whom you have some kind of an adversarial or conflict-based relationship. Some people are very fortunate that they don't have any of those people in their lives. Okay, so think about somebody in the news, maybe. Okay, or something like that. Almost everybody, there's at least someone who for some unexplainable reason just kind of rubs them the wrong way. If you can't think of anyone like that in your life, you're probably not getting out much. So just give that some thought, and again, I'd like for you to try to stick with the same person all the way through this. When you practice this on your own, in between meetings here and stuff, you can experiment with different people, but when you do these the first times, I'd like for you to always kind of think of the same person. And then finally, we'll go to all beings. So you can think a little bit about what that means. And one kind of traditional way to do that is to think of yourself as sort of radiating this idea of loving kindness in all directions. So you can send it to the north and the south and the east and west and up and down. Or you can think about all the beings that walk on the ground and all beings that fly, all beings that swim, that burrow into the ground, things like that. Include those beings that make you a little creepy. You have issues with roaches? Well, send them some loving kindness too. Right? So anyway, we're going to do this in meditation, and I'm not going to guide you, but if you need to, you can open your eyes and look at that. And the expanding circles are the same in every one of these meditations that we do, but with some slight variation. We kind of shuffle some different people to the center as we work with these different mental states. But that's the basis of it. So another topic that you should be aware of as we go into this is the idea of jhana in this process. I've talked a little bit about jhana before. Jhana, or the Sanskrit word is jhana, you'll encounter that, refers to basically meditative absorption. You get really absorbed into your object of meditation. So when you're meditating on the breath, for example, and you enter a state of jhana, the first thing that happens is it becomes fairly easy to stay aware of the breath for some period of time. These things come and go, but you'll find yourself really comfortably concentrating on the breath for a while. When jhana arises when you're working with the Brahma-Viharas, it's a little different. You may have a really kind of emotional upwelling. You may have a sense of warmth or something like that happens. So don't get fixated on that, but be aware that this sensation that arises, or the visualization that arises, or whatever, is kind of important in this case, because it means you've become absorbed into this process of sending out loving kindness, compassion, and so on. And what you would ideally do is be able to maintain that sense of jhana as you go from one person to another. So I know, because I've talked to you about it, many of you, when you first sit down to meditate, you go through sort of a mini metta-bhavana. You wish happiness for yourself, and then you extend that to all beings. And a lot of times when you're thinking, may I be happy, you have this feeling of happiness arise in your heart. Because the happiness that we're talking about at this point is not happiness that's dependent on something outside ourselves. It's not something to strive for. It's not stuff to have. It's a state of mind that arises naturally from within and that's available in the present moment. So that'll come up. And sometimes it can feel very, very pleasant. So as you then think about your loved one, you want to extend that to your loved one also. And then your friend. And then you get to the neutral person, and sometimes that starts to fade a little bit. That sense of that jhana of loving kindness will start to diminish. And then you get to the person you don't get along with, and you really don't want them to feel that way at all. So a part of this process really is to practice with it to the point that you can sustain that throughout. Another part of the process is to recognize when you don't sustain that and to find the resistance. So don't push resistance away. And this is a kind of a difficult thing, but as you work with this, you'll get it. When resistance arises, let resistance be resistance. It's the same thing as when an unpleasant physical sensation arises. If you try to ignore it or you try to make it go away, you're just going to succeed in stressing yourself out. Probably the pain's going to get worse. So it's the same thing with the resistance. Don't make it go away. Just send them loving kindness anyway. Send them these thoughts of happiness anyway, and accept that the resistance is there. We're going to bring some other tools in to use to work with this resistance. So the first thing is to just kind of be aware of when does resistance arise, and what kind of form does it take, so that we'll have something to work with when we get to that point. I'm glad you asked this question, because one of the reasons I wanted to do this without guiding you at this point is that most of you have done this enough that you kind of know what the process is. And you don't need to spend a fixed amount of time on anyone. Establish the thought, may you be happy, may you be free from animosity, may you be free from stress, may you look after yourself with ease. Those are the traditional phrases. You can use whatever means that to you. You don't have to memorize those. Although it's good if you do. That way you're not fumbling around in your mind trying to remember what it was you were supposed to say. But for tonight, may you be happy, and then whatever represents to you some freedom from stress and anger and those kinds of things. And so establish that in your heart and see what comes up when you're thinking about yourself. And then when you transition to your loved one, see what comes up as you do this. And just go on. So this will vary as you work with it with practice. You might find when you get to the person that you feel angry toward, you might spend a lot of time on that person. Everybody else might be a breeze. Or you might find that you discover something when you're thinking about your friend or the neutral person or whatever, that there's something going on in your relationship that you weren't aware of until you started to send this. So we're going to spend 25 minutes all together. Excuse me for my voice kind of coming and going. The oak pollen, that's my excuse. So, you've got a good 5 minutes or so to work with each one, but do what you need to do. And then when you finish, if I haven't rung the bell yet, just rest on your breath for a while. Or you can spend the whole time sending wishes of loving kindness to all beings, which is not a bad thing to do. You can just keep thinking about all the different kinds of beings there are that you encounter and wish them well.